Welcome to the 8th episode of Science, A Peculiar History. The first in a 4-part miniseries about allegations of language deprivation experiments. Now, before Psamtik became king of Egypt, the Egyptians believed that they were the oldest people on earth. But ever since Psamtik became king, and wished to find out which people were the oldest, they have believed that the Phrygians were older than they, and they than everybody else. Psamtik, when he was in no way able to learn by inquiry which people had first come into being, devised a plan by which he took 2 newborn children of the common people and gave them to a shepherd to bring up among his flocks. He gave instructions that no one was to speak a word in their hearing, and they were to stay by themselves in a lonely hut, and in due time the shepherd was to bring goats and give the children their milk and do everything else necessary. Psamtik did this and gave these instructions because he wanted to hear what speech would first come from the children when they were past the age of indistinct babbling. And he had his wish, for one day, when the shepherd had done as he was told for 2 years, both children ran to him, stretching out their hands and calling, "Bekos!" as he opened the door and entered. When he first heard this, he kept quiet about it, but when, coming often and paying careful attention, he kept hearing the same word, he told his master at last, and brought the children into the king's presence as required. Psamtik then heard them himself, and asked to what language the word Bekos belonged. He found it to be a Phrygian word, signifying bread. Reasoning from this, the Egyptians acknowledged that the Phrygians were older than they. This story was told by the ancient Greek historian and travel writer Herodotus in his Histories. While Herodotus wrote the story down in the 5th century BCE, it concerns the Egyptian Pharaoh Psamtik I, Hellenized as Psamtikos, apparently probably pronounced in Egyptian as something like Psamachuk, although Egyptologists would no doubt insist on pronouncing it Pesmetchek, according to their peculiar pronunciation conventions, who reigned around 200 years earlier. It is by far the oldest known reference to a kind of experiment that has provoked intrigue ever since, in the details of the experimental method with its methodically unhinged cruelty, and then the genuinely fascinating question it aims to answer: what language, if any, do humans innately speak? And to some extent a version of this question persists to the present day, even if no linguist would take the idea seriously that there is a particular language that is the innate language of humanity, that people would speak if they were not exposed to any other language. What remains to some extent an unsolved problem is whether or not there are certain features common to all languages that humans have a sort of innate capacity to understand, or whether every single aspect of language is purely a product of learning from the language that we are exposed to. But now, back to Psamtik's experiment. The first question is, did this actually happen? Now, just how reliable Herodotus is as a historian is a complicated and controversial question. As far as I can tell, scholars far more knowledgeable than me have been arguing about this pretty much since his lifetime in the 5th century BCE, and they don't seem to be much closer to a final answer. Over the centuries, this man has picked up 2 nicknames: the Father of History and the Father of Lies. He did come out with some obviously false claims. For example, he says that the Persian Emperor Xerxes invaded Greece with a force of 5,283,220 soldiers, not to mention camp followers. He also makes the bizarre claim that Persian names all end with a s sound. This is sort of mostly true for Greek versions of Persian male names, as it is for Greek male names, but it's absolutely not true for the names in Persian. Xerxes is a Hellenized form of Shayarsha, for example. Then there's things like how in the far east of the Persian Empire there are ants the size of foxes that dig up gold dust, and this became a well-established cryptid over the subsequent centuries. Various explanations have been suggested, including one that I like about how he had acquired a garbled account of Himalayan marmots that, in parts of the Karakoram Mountains, actually do dig up soil very rich in gold dust, that the French explorer Michel Peissel claimed that the local Brokpa people collect. On the other hand, he doesn't seem to have just taken everything at face value. He was sceptical of plenty of things. For example, he remarks on a rumour among the Greeks and the Scythians that the Neuri, who inhabited parts of Eastern Europe, were in fact werewolves, saying, "For my part I do not believe them when they say this, but they say it nevertheless, and swear it moreover." And this was a rumour that, around 500 years later, the Roman geographer Pomponius Mela would take completely at face value. He's also extremely sceptical of the poet Aristeas, who claimed that other parts of Eastern Europe were populated by the one-eyed Arimaspi and griffins that guarded gold. I think it's reasonable to suppose that in most cases Herodotus is reasonably faithfully reporting what his sources tell him, even if the sources themselves aren't necessarily particularly reliable. If people were in the habit of describing scientific experiments that Psamtik did, that does at least suggest something about the pharaoh's reputation and perhaps the sort of person he was, or how he chose to present himself, even if it doesn't tell us with certainty that they actually happened. Anyway, with that caveat we can continue. Herodotus writes that he learned about the experiments from the priests of Hephaestus, the god of volcanoes and metalwork. Although given that this took place in Egypt, he's likely actually talking about the priests of Ptah, the Egyptian god of craftsmen, who the ancient Greeks regarded as Hephaestus's Egyptian equivalent. Herodotus' account is the only account of this event that survives to the present day, but he mentions that other versions of the same story existed in ancient Greece, especially with the gruesome detail of Psammeticus having achieved the linguistic isolation of the children by having them raised by women whose tongues he had cut out. There's also an argument that a version was apparently told in the genealogies of Hecataeus of Miletus, which predates Herodotus by about a century and only survives in fragments. So it's certainly likely that this was an already popular story in Greece at the time, rather than simply an invention of Herodotus. This is not an especially good reason to believe it actually happened, and even if Herodotus genuinely heard it from the priests of Ptah, it's not at all unlikely that they were recounting a legend or an urban myth, rather than a genuine historical event. Maybe the Egyptian priests were telling Herodotus their version of the story, one that portrays their own pharaoh as a benign and curious investigator, who's committed to seeking truth to the point that he's willing to subject the deepest assumptions of his own civilization to honest empirical investigation, rather than a brutal tyrant. Although by our own modern standards, he still comes off looking pretty bad. Not actively cutting out people's tongues is a pretty low bar for benevolence, but I guess most pharaohs did much worse than even this. A quick aside on the Phrygian language that the children apparently spoke. It was spoken in central Anatolia in antiquity, and was one of the most important languages of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. It lasted right through the Roman period, and seems to have become extinct around the 5th century CE. Not much of it is known, and we only have fragmentary inscriptions. What we do know, though, is that bekos actually was the Phrygian word for bread. Interestingly, although not enough is known about Phrygian to say very much definitive about how it relates to other languages, it's reasonably certain that it was an Indo-European language, so distantly related to English, and it's even quite likely that bekos is cognate with bake. One odd thing about this experiment is that the Egyptians seem like far more plausible candidates for the world's first people than the Phrygians. Ancient Egyptian civilization was spectacularly old even at the time of Psamtik. After all, the Great Pyramid is from 2,000 years earlier. The first known Phrygian text, however, dates from the 8th century BCE, so only a few decades before Psamtik's experiment. And the Egyptians were well aware of their civilization's extraordinary antiquity, as indeed were the Greeks. Herodotus himself doesn't explicitly say whether he considers Psamtik's conclusion to be plausible or not, but he doesn't generally seem to think of the Phrygians as being particularly special among the many nationalities he writes about. I've actually seen it suggested that this counts in favour of the story's truth, that the Egyptians wouldn't invent a story that showed that they were inferior to another civilization. It certainly wasn't pro-Egyptian propaganda, but it's still quite possible that it was made up. Other ideas I've come across are that this story might be a Greek legend intended to make fun of Egyptians, stupid enough to consider the possibility that the Phrygians were older than them, or maybe that the Egyptian priests who Herodotus says he got the story from were telling him an absurd story as a prank. If it did happen, we're left with three possibilities. First, it's possible that the babies were simply babbling, as babies do. Maybe Psamtik, confidently expecting them to say something in either Egyptian or Phrygian, interpreted the nonsense sound reported by the shepherd as the closest Phrygian word he could think of. As Anthony Sueck points out, though, it's implausible that the Egyptians conducting this experiment would have rendered random babbling as a vaguely similar-sounding Phrygian word, rather than a vaguely similar-sounding Egyptian one. And apparently the ancient Egyptians had a word bek, meaning oily, white, or innocent, which would have presumably also been a decent approximation of whatever they decided sounded like bekos. Another possibility is that the children were imitating the sound of the goats, which is the only sound they would have heard. This was apparently a fairly popular view in antiquity, but I don't really see any reason to believe this over the former idea. The other problem with this is that goats don't say bekos. If a goat came up to me and said bekos, I would be somewhat alarmed. If the children had said something like meh, this argument would be somewhat understandable, but bekos makes no sense. Maybe something like bekos, but even then it's silly, and there's probably an Egyptian word that would sound just as close. Of course, one further possibility is that the children actually were saying the Phrygian word for bread, because Phrygian is the original language of humanity. I think we also need to say a little bit about the pharaoh himself. We don't know all that much about Psamtik, on the whole. He's hardly Ramesses II or Tutankhamun or Khufu or Akhenaten or Cleopatra, and unless you're a huge ancient Egypt nerd or Herodotus scholar, you've probably never heard of him. And if you have, it's probably purely on account of this experiment. When Psamtik came to the throne, the golden age of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, had ended around 1500 years ago. Even the New Kingdom of Ramesses II, Tutankhamun and the great monuments of Abu Simbel had come to an end amid the raids of the mysterious Sea People over 400 years ago. Towards the end of what historians unimaginatively call the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt had been conquered by invaders from their comparably ancient rival civilization of Kush, far up the Nile in present-day Sudan, who had formed the 25th dynasty, often known as the Black Pharaohs. After a few decades of Kushite rule, Egypt was invaded again, in the 670s BCE, by the Assyrian king Esarhaddon. Esarhaddon's successor, the better-known Ashurbanipal, completed the conquest, and in 664 BCE installed Psamtik, the son of Necho I, king of Sais in the Nile Delta, as one of 12 puppet rulers, ruling Sais and Memphis. Herodotus tells us a story about Psamtik. This time that isn't about a strange experiment, but about a time when the 12 kings sacrificed to Ptah, and were about to offer the god wine. After the priest gave out the cups for the kings to pour the wine into, he found he'd miscounted. There were only 11 cups for 12 kings, and Psamtik was left without one. However, he was resourceful, and took off his bronze helmet to be filled with wine. It turned out, though, that there was a prophecy that said whoever made an offering from a bronze cup would become the sole pharaoh. So just to be safe, Psamtik was banished to the marshlands of the Nile Delta. Now, if you're at all familiar with these kinds of stories, you might have guessed a broad outline of what happens next. Psamtik vowed revenge and consulted another oracle, this time the priest of the winged cobra goddess Wadjet, the patron of Lower Egypt in the city of Buto. The priest told him that vengeance would come when men of bronze appeared from the sea. Psamtik was sceptical, but before long a messenger brought news from the coast. Raiders had arrived, Ionians and Carians from the west coast of Asia Minor, and they wore armour made from bronze. Psamtik saw his chance and promised the raiders handsome rewards if they would support him, and together they overthrew Ashurbanipal's 11 puppet kings, and confirmed the prophecies of the priests of both Ptah the Creator and Wadjet the winged serpent of Lower Egypt. The men of bronze had arrived from the sea, and the man who had offered to Ptah from a bronze cup had become king. It's not clear how much of this is true, even if it's a very good story. The bit about drinking out of the helmet sounds like the sort of thing that would be made up, but Psamtik did ally with the Ionians and Carians, even if these were mercenaries he'd requested from the king of Lydia, rather than raiders who just randomly showed up. But anyway, Psamtik conquered the southern Egyptian city of Thebes in 656 BCE, arranging for Shepenupet II, the daughter of the first Kushite pharaoh Pir, and a powerful priestess of Amun known as the god's wife, who had ended up as co-ruler of the city, to appoint his daughter as her successor, and Upper and Lower Egypt were now firmly unified under a single Egyptian king, for the first time in well over a century. Psamtik remained an ally of the crumbling Assyrian Empire, sending Egyptian troops to the Levant to fight against the numerous peoples, Medes from northwestern Iran, Scythians from the steppe, Babylonians and Chaldeans from Mesopotamia, who successively attacked their territory. And he died in 610 BCE, having established the 26th dynasty as rulers of Upper and Lower Egypt. Like most Egyptian pharaohs, we don't know much about Psamtik's personality. However, there are hints he had a reputation for scientific curiosity. Herodotus also tells us another anecdote about him and his scientific interests. This time he heard it from a scribe at the temple of Neith, in Psamtik's home city of Sais. This time the pharaoh had an exceptionally long rope made, thousands of fathoms long, and attempted to measure the depth of the source of the Nile, at a point where he said it rose between two mountains called Krophi and Mofi, near Aswan, with one half flowing north from there into Egypt, and the other flowing south further into Africa. The scribe told Herodotus that the currents were too strong for the rope to reach the bottom. This isn't anywhere near the actual source of the Nile, but in fairness, Herodotus said, "To me, however, this man seemed not to be speaking seriously when he said that he had certain knowledge of it." and he went to investigate the area himself, finding the first cataract of the Nile, as you would expect, and describing how difficult it is to navigate the shallow waters and strong and unpredictable currents here. This is bringing us in the direction of a question that came up earlier. Whether the story of Psamtik's experiment was a Greek story or an Egyptian story. Herodotus says he heard it from the Egyptian priests of Ptah in Memphis, but also suggests another version of the story already existed as a Greek story. So the situation in that regard is complicated. What I think is a strong argument in favour of the Greek origin of the story, though, is its position in the history of scientific experimentation. As you're likely aware, ancient Egyptian civilization was in many ways exceptionally technologically and intellectually sophisticated for their time. They had a remarkably sophisticated understanding of chemical processes. They developed new dyes and pigments from natural materials. They produced perfumes. They produced the oldest known glass objects from any civilization in history. They had an in-depth understanding of astronomy for the time, enabling them to track the seasons from the position of the stars and align structures, most famously their pyramids, with celestial phenomena. In medicine, they demonstrated impressively detailed knowledge of anatomy. The amount of time they spent cutting up bodies and pulling the organs out to mummify them was no doubt helpful here. We have a few texts describing techniques for performing minor surgery, as well as a range of pharmaceuticals, a lot of which would actually have worked at least a bit. But as far as I can tell, there's not really any evidence that they designed experiments, in the strict sense. To get to their sophisticated medical, chemical, and technological knowledge, they must have made and recorded observations. But there's nothing to suggest that these advancements were made by deliberately designing experiments with dependent variables, independent variables, controls, and hypotheses. They could just as well have been the product of many generations of repeated trial and error. Greek writers, though, tell us other instances of things that look a lot like experiments or thought experiments from the time of Herodotus and earlier. And remember, Herodotus is early on the timescale of classical Greek scholarship, writing decades before Plato and about a century before Aristotle. People sometimes point to a passage in the fragmentary surviving works of the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles, who was almost exactly contemporary with Herodotus, as one of the earliest examples of an experiment, where he gives an analogy in his attempt to explain how breathing and circulation work in terms of air pressure pushing the blood back and forth. He compares it to a clepsydra, from the Greek for water thief, here being an ancient Greek device that used a difference in air pressure to draw liquids from containers, as opposed to a water clock, which is the more common sense of the word. If that confused you, you're not the first. John Burnet's 1920 translation of the known fragments of the works of Empedocles translates clepsydra as water clock, as does William Ellery Leonard's 1908 verse translation. This device was a sphere with very small holes in the bottom and a tube with a hole in at the top. You could dunk it in a liquid and then pull it out, keeping the top hole covered. And without air pressure from above, the air pressure from below would be enough to support the weight of the liquid and keep it in the sphere. But when you remove your thumb, the air pressure entering the tube would tip the balance and push the liquid out. It also won't fill up if you put it in the liquid while covering the top hole. I'll quote William Ellery Leonard's 1908 verse translation because Empedocles wrote in verse, and I think it's a huge shame that nobody writes science books in verse anymore. I've taken the liberty of correcting the mistranslation of clepsydra as water clock. Conveniently, clepsydra scans just as well. As when a little girl plays with a clepsydra of gleaming bronze, as long as ever the opening of the pipe is by her pretty fingers stopped and closed, and thuswise plunged within the yielding mass of silvery water, can the wet no more get in the vessel, but the air's own weight that falls inside against the countless holes keeps it in check, until the child at last uncovers and sets free the thickened air, when of a truth the water's destined bulk gets in as air gives way. First off, this is a huge mood. I wish I was that girl right now, it sounds awesome. It would keep me entertained for hours, just covering and uncovering the clepsydra hole until my fingers went wrinkly. But more importantly, when Empedocles used his clepsydra analogy to attempt to explain how breathing works, he was talking about a girl playing with a clepsydra, doing the exact same thing, not a philosopher conducting a serious experiment. So clearly in the age of the pre-Socratics it was a well-known phenomenon and not a groundbreaking scientific revelation that this happens. There's a bit in Cosmos where Carl Sagan himself talks about this, and he makes out that Empedocles realised that air was a physical substance from thinking about how these devices work. As you can see from the passage you've heard, this is total nonsense. Carl Sagan seems to be confusing this with a sentence in Aristotle's Physics, where he describes the followers of a completely different, significantly earlier pre-Socratic philosopher, Anaxagoras, trying to prove the existence of air. They merely give an ingenious demonstration that air is something, by straining wineskins and showing the resistance of the air, and by cutting it off in clepsydras. It's not clear whether Anaxagoras himself did this demonstration, in which case it would likely have taken place some decades before Herodotus wrote about Psamtik's experiment, but well after Psamtik's experiment was alleged to have taken place, or it was just done by his followers. But in any case, it's still not really an experiment in the strictest sense. There's no reason to suppose Anaxagoras formed his hypothesis without already knowing that a clepsydra will only let water in if the air is able to leave, and decided to test it by seeing what would happen if he tried putting a clepsydra in water with the hole covered, or that he didn't know that an inflated wineskin would be difficult to twist until he'd already formulated his hypothesis. This is not the only seeming proto-experiment from the pre-Socratic period. The PhD thesis of Tyler Mayo from the University of Michigan in 2019 gives a few more interesting examples. We have accounts of the 6th century BCE mathematician, music theorist, cult leader and triangle enthusiast Pythagoras apparently conducting experiments by using weights to vary the tension in strings to test his hypothesis about the pitch of the notes they would make when they were plucked. The problem is that this isn't described until several hundred years later, and the stated results wouldn't actually work. So I don't think we can really say definitively whether or not it actually happened. We've also got a mention of the Pythagorean Hippasus conducting a similar experiment by varying the thicknesses of bronze discs to test the pitches they make when you hit them. The problem is similar. This is mentioned in a few Roman-era sources, one of whom says the story comes from the 4th century BCE Greek philosopher Aristoxenus. None of Aristoxenus' work survives, so we've just got to trust that the author of this marginal note in a copy of Plato's Phaedo, writing 700 odd years after Aristoxenus, that this is what Aristoxenus wrote. And we're hearing the story third hand, so I don't think we can really trust it. Herodotus himself gives us a few other examples of very early experiments. Whether or not they actually happened isn't really all that important here, because someone must have had the idea, even if they were made up. He writes of Croesus, the notoriously rich king of Lydia in western Anatolia in the 6th century BCE, sending people out to test the quality of various oracles, by asking them what he was doing at that moment. He concluded that the Delphic oracle was far superior to the others because it correctly guessed that he was boiling a tortoise and a lamb in a bronze cauldron, an activity that he'd specifically chosen because it was so profoundly weird an oracle would never guess it by chance. In another event Herodotus describes, the Persian Emperor Xerxes had decided against invading Greece, but then had a dream where someone told him to do it. To test whether the dream was for real, he got his uncle and advisor Artabanus to sleep in his bed, arguing that if it was a genuine message from the gods, rather than just a figment of his imagination, Artabanus would have the same dream. And indeed the same guy did appear to Artabanus, laying into him for trying to persuade Xerxes not to invade Greece. And so, Xerxes, having done due diligence in making sure that the dream was the kind of dream he could rely on as a source of advice on military strategy, went ahead with the invasion, with a force of, according to Herodotus, exactly 5,283,220 soldiers, not to mention an uncertain number of camp followers. Herodotus also describes an incident when the Persian Emperor Darius the Great summoned a Greek from one end of his empire, and from the eastern end a member of the Indian tribe that Herodotus calls the Calatii. He asked them about their funeral practices. The Greek told the Calatian about how the Greeks cremate bodies, and the Calatian was disgusted. He told the Greek that the respectful way to dispose of a body was to eat it. The Greek course was similarly disgusted, proving Darius's point that everybody in the world believes that their own culture is the only acceptable way of doing things. There are also earlier examples of rudimentary thought experiments, such as where the 6th century BCE philosopher Xenophanes, writing probably a few decades before Herodotus, made the point that the gods are nothing like human representations of them, by pointing out that different nationalities represent their gods as looking like them, and then extended that to considering hypothetical animals that could draw, and claimed that they would also draw the gods as looking like themselves. What Psamtik does is different from these other early examples of experiments, in ways that seem oddly modern. First, the experiment is testing a hypothesis that the Egyptians are the oldest people in the world. Psamtik was not simply measuring something, like he did when he measured the depth of the first cataract of the Nile. Second, the result of the experiment is not known beforehand. Psamtik was not simply demonstrating a phenomenon that he had already observed, like Anaxagoras playing with his clepsydra. Something comparable to that would have been if it was already well known that children who have not been exposed to language speak Phrygian, and Psamtik was showing someone this in order to reinforce his point that the Phrygians are the oldest nation. Third, the experimenter has deliberately engineered an unnatural scenario specifically to test the hypothesis. The children were not being kept isolated from language for any other reason than to test whether they would speak Egyptian. In this way it's different from, say, an early hominid working out the best way to make flint spearheads by trial and error, since the early hominid would have been making lots of spearheads anyway, and figuring out the optimal technique is just a fortunate side effect of that process. Fourth, the hypothesis is general, rather than specific to these experimental subjects. Psamtik was not just trying to find out whether these children are inherently predisposed to speak Egyptian. He was generalizing from the children involved in the experiment to children in general. In this way it's different from Croesus testing the reliability of the oracles, in that he was only trying to find something out about those specific oracles, rather than oracles in general. Or Xerxes testing whether his specific dream was genuine, rather than trying to find out something about dreams in general. Presumably this isn't the first time anyone ever had the idea of an experiment. I'd be surprised if no early hominid ever deliberately tested two different methods for making flint arrowheads to see which one was better. And the experiment Herodotus tells us Darius did, with the Greek and the Indian cannibal, mostly fits these criteria as well. Darius had the hypothesis that everybody thinks their own culture is superior. He was testing something, as opposed to making a point by demonstrating an already familiar phenomenon. He deliberately got the Greek and the Indian to explain their funeral practices, rather than simply observing them having a conversation. And he was trying to find something out about human cultures in general, rather than these specific people's attitudes. On top of all that, Herodotus, or whoever told him about Psamtik's experiment, seems to have still basically understood the concept of an experiment as something someone might do, and what it might involve. It doesn't sound like the concept is particularly novel to Herodotus. but it does seem to be one of the earliest. Going back to the way there's no other evidence that the ancient Egyptians really did experiments in a modern sense, that's often given as a strong piece of evidence that the story is indeed Greek in origin. Alan Lloyd points this out, saying that the idea of doing experiments to find things out is Greek in origin, as is the assumption that people will speak the language of their ancestors, and that all languages share a common ancestor. I will come clean here and say that I can't find a copy of Alan Lloyd's commentary on Herodotus for under £150, so I'm relying on how other authors quote him. He says in a footnote to a paper, which is on JSTOR where I can get 100 free articles per month, that it is inconceivable that an Egyptian king could have proceeded in the way described by Herodotus. We can only assume that these interests have been foisted onto Psammeticus by Greeks themselves. On the whole, I have to agree. I think this story is a Greek story invented by Greeks about an Egyptian king taking a fundamentally Greek approach to addressing a problem. And it actually represents an important milestone in the early development of scientific experimentation. Whoever came up with the story has designed an experiment that sounds much more modern than any other anecdotes we know about from the same time. Having established the Greekness of this story, we can look at how it fits into ancient Greek ideas about linguistics more generally. And linguistics was an issue that the ancient Greeks generally did take an interest in, including the origin of language. The result of the experiment that Herodotus reports, or even the assumptions underlying the methodology, certainly weren't taken for granted as linguistic fact. The anonymous text the Disoilogoi, Contrasting Arguments, written in Sicily in the late 5th century BCE, probably a few years after the death of Herodotus, argues that language is in fact something we learn, rather than being known innately. And if someone is not persuaded that we learn our words, but thinks we are born knowing them, let him form a judgment from what follows. If someone should send a child away to the Persians as soon as he was born, and should bring him up there, hearing nothing of the Greek tongue, he would speak Persian. And if one were to bring a Persian child here, he would speak Greek. We learn our words in this fashion, and we don't know who our teachers are. It's worth noting that this doesn't directly contradict Psamtik's assumptions. It could still be the case that if the child was not exposed to any language, he would end up speaking Phrygian. But the author of the Disoilogoi is very insistent in general in this passage that language is learned, while Psamtik seems to take it for granted that it's innate. The debate about the innateness of language is one we're quite familiar with. Nobody important nowadays believes that any particular language is innately known. But Noam Chomsky's idea of universal grammar, that humans have an instinctive knowledge of certain aspects of language in general, is still fairly respectable. However, Psamtik's experiment also relates to other linguistic concerns of the ancient Greeks, many of which a modern linguist would consider to be quite strange, including concerning the origin of language and where the meanings of words originate. Take as an example Plato's dialogue Cratylus, written presumably a few decades after Herodotus wrote about Psamtik's experiment in his histories. It's concerned primarily with the idea of the correctness of names, that is, the question of why words mean the things they mean, and consists of a debate between two characters, Hermogenes and Cratylus, mediated by Socrates. Hermogenes advances the position that words have their meanings purely on account of convention. Dog only denotes the animal it does because English speakers all agree that it denotes that animal. This is the position held by basically all present-day linguists, apart from with a small handful of obviously onomatopoeic words. In ancient Greece it had previously been held by the pre-Socratic philosopher Democritus, perhaps best known for his atomism, his now thoroughly vindicated belief that all matter is made up of minuscule particles in constant motion. Hermogenes supports it by pointing out that people speak different languages with completely different words for the same things. The position taken on by the title character, Cratylus, is much stranger from a modern perspective. Cratylus holds that there is some natural property of words that makes them particularly appropriate to use for particular meanings. There's something about dogs that makes the word dog particularly suited to them. Socrates challenges both Hermogenes and Cratylus. First he criticises Hermogenes' conventionalism, arguing that words are tools for the task of identifying distinct things. Tools have to be made for a specific purpose, and some tools are better for the purpose than others. So it must be the same with words. A word can be objectively well suited or poorly suited to the task of identifying the thing it's supposed to identify. Socrates then proceeds to take wild stabs at the etymologies of various Greek words. For instance, he claims that anthropos, the Greek word for human, comes from anathron haupope, meaning one who observes what he has seen, or that phronesis, meaning wisdom, derives from phoraskairunoesis, meaning perception of motion and flux. Here he's breaking down complex words into compounds of other words, and he even attempts to argue that maybe the individual words, of which complex words are formed, can be broken down into individual sounds that all contribute to the meaning. It's genuinely controversial which position Socrates ends up coming down on, and it's not completely clear how much of this etymological reasoning is intended sarcastically, or as a reductio ad absurdum. But he seems to end up at a compromise between the views of Cratylus and Hermogenes, where words are composed from parts that are supposed to have something to do with their meanings, but that the original process of assigning meanings was imperfect, and the meanings have changed since. Later on, the Stoics would come to agree with the naturalist position from Cratylus, that words have particular natural connections to their meanings, in keeping with the overall Stoic belief in a logically ordered universe. They took this position to an extreme, attempting to develop their understanding of the universe and the gods through the study of etymologies. Indeed, the word etymology, whose own etymology is the Greek for the study of the true sense of words, was likely coined by the 3rd century BCE Stoic philosopher Chrysippus, who was reported to have died from laughing at a donkey eating figs. For example, the founder of Stoicism, Zeno of Citium, supports his claim that the primordial void of Greek mythology, called chaos, was made of water, by deriving the word chaos from the verb heiesthai, meaning to be poured. The two words are in fact completely unrelated, and Chrysippus was said to have believed that the name of Zeus, Zena in the accusative, was a result of the fact that he's the cause of all life, or Zen in Greek. Again, the two words are actually completely unrelated. Epicurus lived between 341 and 270 BCE, so almost exactly contemporary with Zeno of Citium. Epicurus is notable for his materialistic worldview and his atomism, i.e. his belief that all matter is made up of extremely small atoms that are in constant motion, following the view of the pre-Socratic Democritus, who we mentioned earlier, and nowadays he's best known for his ethics, in particular the claim that pleasure is the supreme good and we should seek pleasure and avoid pain. As to the philosophy of language, Epicurus and his followers were less interested in the truths that can be learned from etymologies, and more interested in how humans began to develop the use of language. Epicurus rejected out of hand the idea that Socrates seems to have taken for granted in Cratylus, that there was someone or something that deliberately decided to exercise dictatorial power to allocate names. Nor let us believe those philosophers who say that names were given to things by prescription and teaching, so that men might have symbols of them for the sake of easy communication one with another. The idea is absurd. In fact, it is more absurd than any absurdity, as well as being quite impossible that anyone should bring together so many multitudes, being only one himself, for as yet there were no kings nor even letters where there were no sounds. For as to these now, for the mere collecting of these, it needed a royal command for their collection to take place. And after bringing them together, that he should instruct them like a schoolmaster, taking hold of a bough and touching each thing, and should say as he did so, "This is to be called stone, and this wood, and this man." Epicurus, much like his fellow atomist Democritus, claimed that the first people to use language made random noises based on just how things made them feel. And within each particular tribe they gradually agreed on noises corresponding to particular things to make it easier to communicate. And so was largely echoing the conventionalist view of homogenies in Cratylus, that the meanings of words are a matter of convention within a particular community. He wrote in his letter to Herodotus, writing to a completely different Herodotus to the one who we've already talked about, who had been dead for several decades, "Thus names too did not originally come into being by imposition, but men's own natures underwent peculiar feelings and received peculiar impressions, which varied from race to race. And they exhaled breath in a peculiar way, according to each of the feelings and impressions, according also to the racial difference from place to place. Later, particular coinings were made by agreement within the individual races, so as to make the designations less ambiguous and more concisely expressed." Diodorus Siculus, a Greek-speaking Sicilian historian from the 1st century BCE, in his Bibliotheca Historica, a sprawling attempt in 40 books, of which only 15 survive in full, at chronicling the entire history of the known world from the origin of Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilization to Caesar's conquest of Gaul, which was pretty much contemporary at that time, similarly rejected the idea that there is an original perfect language, and instead claimed that their words were confused, without any certain signification, but by degrees they spoke articulately, and making signs, and giving proper terms to everything upon occasion. At length their discourse became intelligible to one another, but being dispersed into several parts of the world, they spoke not all the same language, everyone using that dialect proper to the place, as his lot fell, upon which account there were various and all sorts of languages in the world. And these associations of men first planted all the nations of the world. It's interesting that both Epicurus and Diodorus are claiming that different groups independently invented language, out of a sort of primitive grunting. In some sense, kind of the absolute opposite of the idea that there is a particular primordial language. But at the same time supporting the idea that the capacity for language is an innate aspect of what it is to be human, a bit like modern theories of universal grammar, but that this has to be sort of activated by particular natural circumstances. Lucretius, an atomist in the mould of Democritus, in his rather uninformatively titled De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, specifically makes a connection between how the first humans to speak used language and how children communicate before learning to use language. But the various sounds of the tongue nature drove them to utter, and convenience moulded the names for things. Not far otherwise than very speechlessness is seen to drive children to the use of gesture. when it makes them point with the finger at things that are before them. Epicurus and Lucretius don't concern themselves particularly with whether or not words have any particular connection to the objects they represent. This reflects a general Epicurean concern with trying to establish material causes of things, rather than viewing the world in a teleological sense. To me, this feels far more modern than the view of Cratylus or of the Stoics. Psamtik's experiment sort of presupposes something a bit like the naturalist position, or at the very least it would certainly make no sense if Psamtik accepted the conventionalist position of Hermogenes, or the account of Epicurus or Diodorus, whereby the original language that was innate would just have been a sort of meaningless caveman grunting that would require the presence of a human society to be shaped into a coherent language. The Epicurean model isn't really compatible with the idea of the primacy of any particular language, and instead supposes that each separate community of people naturally develops their own language aligned with their own communication needs. I guess, considering there were two children, then in the Epicurean model they might have developed a language between themselves by gradually transforming their babblings into meaningful words, but this wouldn't correspond to any real language. Whereas in the Stoic model, maybe they could be expected to instinctively hit upon the natural words for things, and maybe these correspond to their Phrygian words. And it's important to remember that Psamtik never considered the possibility that the children don't speak any language at all. The question was, which language will they speak, not which language, if any, will they speak. Of course, eventually the Romans would convert to Christianity, and the classical world would begin to embrace another view of the origin of language, one that has already been popular among Jewish intellectuals for several centuries. The Bible is very clear that, shortly after creating the world, God spoke to Adam and Eve in some particular language. The story in the Bible, which you probably already know, is that in the first few generations after the flood, everybody on earth spoke the same language, presumably the same language spoken in the Garden of Eden. And then everyone decided to build a big tower all the way up to heaven. God was pissed off and decided he would thwart their efforts by creating a huge and diverse and splendid array of languages that is fascinating and beautiful and miraculous, but admittedly inconvenient if you're trying to organise a major construction project. The Bible itself gives no information at all about what language was spoken before the Tower of Babel. But a story had developed, loosely based on the Bible, that explains it. Various Roman Christian theologians, including probably the most influential of them all, St. Augustine of Hippo, wrote that there was one person who refused to help with building the Tower of Babel. Heber, or Eber, a great-great-grandson of Noah and the ancestor of the Hebrews who took their name from him. As a reward, the story goes that he was allowed to keep his original language. I'm not sure how much use that would have been when nobody else spoke it anymore, which was, of course, Hebrew, showing that's the language that God spoke to Adam. If the world's languages were confused by God at the Tower of Babel, it's presumably not possible to find deep truths about the world based on Greek etymologies. After all, the story of the Tower of Babel presents, if taken at face value without any augmentation, an argument for the equality of languages, that all the world's languages were created in the same moment of punishment, equally fallen and corrupt, with no connection to the divine language of Eden. It follows that there isn't one particular language for which the view of Cratylus is correct. However, if you believe the legend of Heber, you can still have something to cling on to. As we leave the intellectual concerns of the pagan ancient Mediterranean behind for those of the medieval Mediterranean, dominated by the Abrahamic religions, the question of humanity's default language remained a source of great interest, and the story of Heber was not always accepted as fact. Thank you for listening. Join us for the next episode, when we're going to talk about another story about another ruler who was claimed to have... Thank you for listening. Join us in the next episode, when we're going to talk about another story about another ruler who supposedly conducted his own version of this strange experiment.